All right, it's 4:30, so let's get started with the last session of the day. Thank you very much for showing up to talk with us about battling fake news and developing digital literacy skills in the legal profession. I am Carol Watson from the University of Georgia School of Law. My colleague Chris Nijman-Haas will also be speaking in today's program. Carolyn Osborne, who was listed in the program, could not be with us because of a scheduling conflict, but she is with us here in spirit, I'm sure. So we're going to get started with talking about fake news, a topic that I'm sure as everyone involved in the information industry will agree is a burning and hot topic that we all need to address. We're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to mix content and tips and tools together and talk to you a little bit about what fake news is, how it's produced, that sort of thing, but we're also going to talk about designing digital information literacy programs and what sorts of things you should be telling your law firm partners or your students in the law school. So I wanted to be sure first that we were all on the same page, and I think that the definition of fake news, the key takeaway is the word here, intentional. I believe everyone knows, yes, it's false, yes, it's news, but the intent to deceive are the people that we're targeting and that we are going to go after when we're combating fake news. Fake news usually has popular appeal, unfortunately, and it is widely spread among consumers. What it is not from a reliable source, an established media source with journalistic standards. It's not a simple mistake or error because of the 24-hour news cycle. It's not uncommon for a news source to make an error, but they correct it. And most importantly, it's not news that you don't like, right? I think we can all agree with that one. Some of the common characteristics are that fake news play on emotions. We tell students that if you're excited by this headline or it's really shocks you or surprises you, you should pause and think about it for a second, because the emotional impact is one of the biggest drivers for the fake news industry. It often comes disguised as real news from imposter sources. You may or may not have seen this particular article. This was the #1 shared fake news story in 2016, the Obama signing the executive order banning the Pledge of Allegiance. It was from abcnewscom.co, not abcnews.com, but it was such a clever fake that people were like, oh, ABC News, let's start sharing it. Not uncommon. There are lots of imposter sources in some of the fake news media. You'll see things like the Boston Tribune. Everybody read the Boston Tribune? Yeah, there's no such thing. But they make it look like it's from real resources. There are often manipulated images, and for some reason, hurricanes have generated a lot of manipulated images, particularly Harvey. This one was one where they said, look at this flooded Houston airport. Well, no. You probably saw the ones with the shark swimming down the street. That was another popular one, the alligators. No, this is LaGuardia, and it was a what if the sea levels rise, someone photoshopped. This is what LaGuardia would look like if the sea levels continue to rise. And there have been several scientific studies. We are, as humans, are terrible at detecting manipulated images. We tend to see it and believe it. This is not a problem that is limited to the U.S. It is a global issue. India is one example. India has had a tremendous difficulty with fake news. One of the stories that came out fairly recently, there was new currency issued in India, and so the fake news sources started saying, oh, they're GPS chips embedded in the currency so they can track where the currency is and come after you if you're hoarding it. Many more stories. There was a story in India about there's going to be a shortage of salt, and so there was a run on salt purchases. at the supermarket. So you might be saying to yourself, well, why don't we just legislate and prevent these fake news outlets? Let's go after them. Let's sue them. Well, Germany tried that, and Germany has recently enacted it's half aimed at social media, at hate news, and it's half aimed at fake news. But they have received a lot of criticism for the statute that they have recently enacted. In fact, I saw the 3 countries that praised the new German law were Singapore, Russia, and the Philippines. Not really like the countries you want praising your new law. And the problem with the German social media law or fake news law is that what's considered fake to one person may not be considered fake to the next person. For example, this is a great chart that we like to show students if we're talking about digital information literacy. It was done by an attorney in Colorado, and it shows the media bias. She has revised it a couple of times to pick up, you can see liberal versus conservative. Chris is going to talk in more detail about this particular chart, but I think it's a good example of the slippery slope that you get into when you start trying to legislate someone's right to say out and out falsehoods. It's a fine line between First Amendment rights and the need for accurate information. So just quickly, I do like and one more point. Have any of you read this article in Wired magazine about the Macedonian teenagers who produced fake news? Anybody read this article? No. It's an excellent news story about how these Macedonian teenagers who were just poor, became quite wealthy almost overnight because of their industry creating fake news. I mean, by the number of hits, the more sensationalistic they could make it, the more money they were making. They were spewing champagne bottles just for fun. And these were people that were quite poor before they got into this business. So I would recommend that you look up the Wired article if you're ever interested in sort of the how did we get to this point. So speaking of how did we get to this point, I do like for students to understand that fake news is not a new phenomenon. Does anyone have a guess as to when the term fake news was first coined? How many years ago? Throw out a number.
A century.
1 century. How many?
50.
50, a century. Anybody else?
125.
Oh, you know.
I do not know. I haven't talked about this with Chris.
Wait, 125 on the nose. You're exactly right. 125 years ago, linguists have traced the term fake news. It's not because we didn't have fake news more than 125 years ago. It's because the word fake really wasn't used that much in the English vernacular. It was false news prior to that. Because as a matter of fact, as soon as we could speak, I'm sure we all can imagine that we were sitting around the fire going, it was this big, I swear, and it had teeth. So there are many, many examples throughout history. And I could do a whole afternoon of just the historic examples of fake news. One of them was the rivalry between Octavian, who was Caesar's adopted son, and Mark Antony. Octavia waged a media campaign against Antony, said that he was a liar and a drunk, and that he was under the influence and spell of Cleopatra. He even produced little coins that said, you know, Antony is a drunk, instead of tweets. So there were lots of tactics that were used in their rivalry that historians often point to as a prime example of the use of false information. As you well can imagine, with the advent of the printing press, fake news expanded tremendously. As soon as the first pamphlets started rolling out, they were criticizing candidates for the Pope immediately. Just as soon as the ink was dry, fake news was starting to pop up. Fast forwarding, because we don't have, I know as much as you would like to hear me talk about in the history of fake news, the New York Times was a real turning point in the news industry. When Adolph Ox purchased the New York Times, his goal was to produce accurate, factual-based newspapers that would be helpful for business men who wanted to follow what the accurate news sources were for the time. You probably remember this news broadcast. Everyone knows the War on the Worlds, right? And how it scared people so much they were running into the streets crying, ah! Not really. That was fake news. People weren't that scared. It wasn't that realistic. That was just what the newspaper industry said because they were trying to discredit the radio industry. Radio was taking over their advertising, so they tried to make it like, you can't believe anything that's on the radio. They had people running in the streets because they were so frightened. So, of course, the main turning point for us, and the reason many of you are in this room probably, was the Pizzagate. And I don't think I probably have to explain what the Pizzagate incident was, but it woke us up. I think it was the real turning point when we all said, this is out of control. We really have to do something about it. And I think there are many, many reasons how we got here, why we're here. I'm sure this images illustrate what many of you know is how we got here. But right now, the money that is generated from news, a lot of it flows back to Facebook and to Google, not to reporters and publishers and the New York Times and whatnot. So in the absence of this workable news model, we have a lot of wild rumors and conspiracy theories that are easy to be thrown around. And we have actually entered what we call the post-truth era or world, where objective facts just aren't as persuasive or influential as they have been in should I say our lifetime? Can I say that? Our lifetime. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris to do the next segment of the presentation.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, just a little bit more about why it matters and how it's related. Anybody want to place a bet as to whether I trip over this? And how that relates to how society is responding to expertise these days. And then there was actually a recent research study that I want to talk to you about how fake news spreads. So I really should have, there we go. Come on. There we go. So you can guess from these three photos, at least the first two, fake news, Carol talked about Pizzagate. It can have really serious consequences, and you know about the anti-vaccine movement, climate change. The third one is actually South Sudan. And I found this really, I find them all troubling, but I found this one in particular troubling. So South Sudan was going through government collapse and a civil war, and there started to be social media posts spreading claiming that the president had been killed and that troops that were loyal to his adversary were preparing to attack the government, and they were both false. And it was fueling conflict and beginning to look like genocide was really going to take off in the South Sudan. What's interesting is that many of these posts actually came from outside of the country. They came from people who were just trying to incite one side or the other and almost led to genocide. And then I thought, The other interesting thing about this is that following someone's lead, the president tells a U.S. senator who's there visiting that it's all the fault of the media. The media is reporting fake news. We might have heard that somewhere before. But the consequences are real and quite deadly. And so I just wanted to point that one out. The other thing I want to tie it to is, and because I think they're related, is that there's been a rise of people not trusting experts. Traditionally, our information was filtered through editors and publishers that we trusted. We listened to experts. This is totally my hypothesis, but I think that part of this increasing lack of trust in academia and expertise can be blamed on, right, the open internet. And people think that they can get any information they need off of the internet so they can form their own opinion, and that everyone's opinion is equally valid, right? And so this is the story that we're starting to hear from people. And I think there's a connection there between that tendency and the fake news tendency and how it spreads. There is a really good book called The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters by Thomas Nichols that I do recommend. And I won't beat that horse to death, but there's a quote that I think sort of sums this all up, where he says, "None of us is a Da Vinci painting the Mona Lisa in the morning and designing helicopters at night." That we all have our limitations as to what we're experts about. So, related, lies sound like facts to those who've been conditioned to misrecognize the truth. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in filter bubbles and echo chambers, and how fake news spreads on social media. Facebook and other platforms, as you know, are designed to show us more of what we like. And our Google searches shape ads we see, and our purchasing history gets tied into that. Have you ever made the mistake of buying a gift for someone on Amazon who has very different tastes from you, and then you get all the, oh man, that's annoying. But unfortunately what that does is, right, it just reinforces our biases. We all know this. So let's talk a little bit about how big of a problem this is. How many, let's do a show of hands. How many of you have ever clicked on fake news?
When you knew it or when you didn't know it?
Well, you may have not known it, right? You click on it and then you start looking at it and you're like, I shouldn't have clicked on this, right? How many of you have shared it and then realized that you shared it? Yeah. I mean, it can take a while. This is a very sophisticated, people are making a lot of money off of this. And they're getting more and more sophisticated about how they do this. One thing that I want you to take from this is that the fake news actually spreads faster than real news, which is frightening. According to this study, there were a total of 8.7 million Facebook engagements. Engagements is, you know, you click on it or you read it or you share it, for fake news stories about the election, in comparison to 7.3 million engagements for mainstream news stories. So fake news is outpacing mainstream news, which is terrifying. So let's talk a little bit about the study that I mentioned. It's published in the March 9th issue of Science magazine. And I'm actually going to start by talking about this cover because I think it's really interesting and it explains the research pretty well. They actually have an article in the issue about how the cover was designed. And what the guy did who designed the cover is he didn't just draw it. He actually developed a mathematical model using the research results to create this map, essentially, of the results. So it's a little hard to see because of the washed out nature, but there's yellow and blue, so yellow and blue bright spots, right? So those are two social media posts on a similar topic. The yellow spots represent the spread of a false story on social media, while the blue spots, right, so this is yellow and this is blue, okay? And the blue spots are the spread of a true story. So you can see the significant difference here by looking at it visually. The other thing that's interesting to me from the study is that there's very limited overlap, right? So you can see that there's very limited, the same people aren't seeing, right? People who are seeing the fake news aren't seeing the true news. And there's very little overlap in accounts between the two. So the study analyzed, here's what they did for the study. They analyzed all contested news stories spread on Twitter from 2006 to 2017. So they studied 126,000 stories tweeted by 3 million people over 4.5 million times. So this is a pretty good base. This isn't, we talked to 25 people and this is what we found. The researchers used 6 reputable fact-checking sites to determine which stories were true. There was 97 to 98% agreement between the fact-checking sites on the veracity. And then the study looked at the number of cascades as well as the depth of the cascade. So the cascade being, you know, how it spread out, and then how many times from that spread someone retweets, that thing, right? True stories took 6 times as long to reach 1,500 people as false stories. And they took 20 times as long to reach the same depth. Quote from the researchers, falsehood diffused significantly farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in all categories of information, and the effects were even more pronounced for false political news. So false political news was even worse than all other kinds of news, traveled deeper, more broadly, reached more people, and was more viral than any other category of false information. Falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted than true stories. So the research shows, and what they've concluded is that contrary to conventional wisdom, that the bots are accelerating the spread, it's actually us. It's human beings that are accelerating the spread of fake news. And so we have to focus on the human behavior. We can't accept the idea that, well, it's Russian bots or whatever, and, you know, we have to approach it from that standpoint. We need to approach it from people. And I'm going to stop there and let Carol talk a little bit about tips and tools.
So now that Chris has cheered us up, all that great news about the dire consequences, and she is absolutely right. Let's talk about some of the tips and tools, things that you can either use yourself or you can design literacy programs to teach your students or work into your classes of instruction. So obviously the first thing to do is to take a look at either some of the programs designed by libraries or journalism schools, and there are lots and lots of materials out there. All you have to do is Google LibGuides and fake news, and you will find a lot of great things. People have clever little tests like the crap test. You've seen that one. People have made bookmarks. There's lots of good ones. I like the 2 tips. Actually read what you share. Read as widely as possible. That's probably really good advice for life itself. So, of course, when you're designing a program, you're going to think about these obvious kinds of skills that you want to emphasize with your students, and you're going to focus upon fact checkers. I think we're all familiar with a great many of these, the Snopes of the world, the things that help you identify if an article or a story is true. One of the pieces of advice people often give students is if you're at all suspicious, look at other news organizations or other people reporting the same story. If not, you should be tipped off that there's a problem. Another tool that people might find helpful to use are image detection tools. Many of us in here are probably familiar with reverse image searching on Google. You can pop in the web address or you can upload an image. And both Google and there's another really good service, TinEye, that will let you do reverse image searches, and you'll be surprised to find out where some of these images have come from. Another one that I would recommend is photo forensics that will look for places in an image where it might have been altered. In particular, here's one, Kim Jong-un with a diskette in his hand. That's a disk, that's a floppy disk for some of you younger people in the room. But upon examining it in photo forensics, he clearly had something else in his hand originally. This was not what was in the original photo. So I would recommend to you that your students should be familiar with some of the image detection tools. Of course, Facebook is a main purveyor of many of these items, and you can be like me and point it out to your friends and relatives, many of which are your relatives. Every time they share a fake news story, you can be right there with them. But perhaps you don't want to be quite as obnoxious as I am. I can't imagine why. So Facebook is now has incorporated some new tools that will help you out. If you want to be quiet about what you're doing, you can now mark a story by clicking the ellipsis next to the post you'd like to mark as false. And they have an option for you to click, it's a false news story. And they'll take it from there. And if enough of us do that, for goodness sakes, maybe we can stem the tide. Facebook has also been experimenting, I don't know if you've noticed it, they now start to show you about this article. Has anybody noticed the little, it's right here, about this article where this white dot is. And when you click on it, it'll tell you the news source. This one, I know it's hard to read from back there, says the Associated Press is the U.S., blah, 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 blah. It will show you related articles in case you want to verify, and it'll show you a little graph of where the article has been shared. So now they're trying to enact tools to help combat some of the evil that they have caused today. Another technique that you may want to emphasize to your students or try yourself is to obtain a browser extension. There are several that exist. Some exist for Chrome, some exist for Firefox. This one is particularly popular, Media Bias Fact Check, kind of like the chart that we were looking at earlier. If you are looking, this one says New York Times, left center bias. It gives you a little background when you click on the, I want to know more about the media source. This is an extension that's available for Chrome, but there's one for Firefox with a different name. It's called Google News Bias, and there are more than one variety out there. There's another one, an open source one called BS Detector. And they do a nice job. They categorize things according to these categories, things like junk science or hate news. It actually works on Twitter too, or any kind of news site that you want to visit. In fact, I saw one, I couldn't include all the wonderful tools that I came up with, but there's one that you called, like bot detect, that will tell you if the Twitter account you're looking at is likely not to be a real person. So if you Google the browser extensions, there are lots of options, and this is something you could show your students that, hey, if you really want to get more down under the hood of what you're looking at, here's a great tool. I also had a great time getting ready for this program, literally playing games. This is a nice tool that you can introduce to your students to gamify some of these checking their skills. How good are they at detecting fake news? The three that I'm going to recommend today are Factitious, Bad News, and BBC iRobot. We're going to look at them just briefly. First one that I got hung up on was Factitious, and it works a lot like Tinder. You swipe right or left right or left, depending on if you think it's true or not. So here we have our nice article about hash browns have been recalled because they had golf ball bits in them. And you might read that and go, wow, that sounds pretty weird. I don't know if I believe that or not. If you want a little more information, you can click at the bottom and it'll tell you what the source of the story is. So in this case, the source is a North Carolina TV station. So how many people think it's true that golf balls were in the hash browns? How many people think it's false? It's true. There were golf balls in the hash browns. But, and this little game goes on and on. I got sucked in. I was still playing. Here's one about Melania settling a defamation suit against the Daily Mail and for $2.9 million. And the source was the New York Daily News. True or false? Ding, ding, ding. Take a second. We're going to do a show of hands.
I want to check out the sources before I can answer that question.
So you would want to check out the New York Daily News?
I want to see if anybody else was reporting the same story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But as a first cut, are you familiar with the New York Daily News? So what would your first blush be?
Well, false, but I actually think there may be some truth to it.
It is true. It is true, and you are exactly right. The New York Daily News is not known for their sterling reputation. And so, what does it say? Should be checked against other news sources. So you're 100% on the money with that. So it's a nice way to emphasize that to your students. And this is a fast game. You play, you're flicking, you're reading the headlines, you're clicking, it just runs through. It's a lot of fun to play. And so it's a way to get your students engaged. That's kind of, without them even knowing they're learning. The other one I liked a lot was Bad News. And in Bad News, you're in charge of producing fake news. You are the creator, and so you are going to start, and you earn credibility and points and followers depending upon your answers, and you run through different scenarios like, we're going to borrow somebody's credibility. Do you want to fake a Twitter account, or do you want to impersonate someone? And as you run through, you get more points. This one takes about 15 minutes to play. It's not that long, but it's a lot of fun. Now, the more in-depth one is the BBC iReporter. And this one's kind of cool because it puts you in the shoes of being a BBC reporter, but you're racing against time. You want to get that story out there because you want to make the impact, but you want it to be accurate. And so you have to make decisions as if you were a real reporter on the ground trying to decide these things. I'd say this one is probably more helpful for a journalism student who's really trying to understand how news is produced. But it's, you have to avoid a lot of pitfalls to get your news story out to the, it's a lot more like live action. It has a lot of video, like, okay, we're going to get this story out. So those are 3 games. There are others. I happen to like those 3. I do recommend, especially Factitious. I think your students would like having a chance to play them. A couple of other points I want to make before I turn it back over to Chris. Like Facebook, Google is also trying to clean up the fake news. They have invested millions in a disinfo lab. They're trying to make it so that people can't game their algorithms and spread stories more readily. But I can't end on positive news. I have to end on, although this is funny, this is pretty scary news, and that is, if you've heard lately about deep fakes, the synthetic media, it is getting more and more difficult to detect videos and images. Deep fakes, or Fake app, lets you put a celebrity face on anything. And so for some reason, maybe someone in the audience younger can explain this, there's a phenomenon of putting Nicolas Cage's face on anything and everything. So you can find lots of Nicolas Cage images on the web. And has anybody seen the one, the video where Jordan Peele does Obama? So realistic. So until you see, if you haven't seen it yet, you can Google it, and then you'll see the image of Obama speaking and Jordan's right next to him, and then you realize, oh my gosh, that's not Obama speaking. So it's getting harder, not easier, for us to fight this phenomenon, especially when it comes to video that's coming out now. So I'm going to let Chris finish us up.
Okay, so I'm going to talk some more about what we can do to teach our students to recognize fake news. I randomly picked 4.0 because, you know, digital literacy 1.0 is so passe now. The thing that I think is interesting about this conversation about how do we create curriculum that deals with fake news is that this is really a problem that we've been trying to address for a long time, right? Information literacy it's been around even longer than we've used the buzzword information literacy to describe it. We're trying to teach people to assess the information they're receiving. Does this sound like what we try to teach them in legal research? And determine whether or not they should rely upon it, right? So it's really an old problem that we're trying to address. It's just got a new package that it's in. But let's just try to start with a common definition of information literacy just to get us on the same page. We could argue about what I'm about to say, but I think it's a good place to start. So for those of you who are not librarians, information literacy means the skills to find and evaluate information as fit for a specific need, distinguish the reliable from the unreliable, and recognizing satire, hoaxes, and propaganda. Okay, so let's start there. There are some elephants in the room that we just need to recognize before we start talking about teaching. One is what I mentioned earlier. We've been trying to teach information literacy for a long time. And now I'm being depressing again. It doesn't seem to be working. And so we need to figure out why it's not working and what we can do to try and reach students. Another elephant in the room I mentioned earlier, I think Carol talked about it, is confirmation bias. We need to get students to break out of that bubble and recognize that it's a problem. And I actually think confirmation bias is not just a problem for social media. You see this when you're teaching students research, that they find the case that supports their side and then they stop because they think they're done, and they miss all the stuff that doesn't support their side. So again, it's really just an old problem that is repackaged. Third elephant, obviously how we get information has changed. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the percentages of people who say that they get most of their news off of Facebook and Twitter. And that obviously has an impact because it can spread faster and there's no mediation there. And then finally, Carol mentioned this with the story from Macedonia. Fake news makes a lot of money for people, and that means it's not going to go away anytime soon. And because it makes a lot of money, they're going to get more and more sophisticated, as they already have. And we need to recognize that when we're trying to impress upon our students this problem. So this study, in 2017, 2/3 of U.S. adults get their news from social media. Now, that doesn't mean that's the only place they get their news, but they get their 70% get their news, not from, sorry, 2/3 of people get their news from social media. And 20% self-report that they get most of their news from social media. Okay. The difference between that, in 2014, there was a similar survey, slight difference in wording. The 2014 survey said, where do they see their news, versus the 2017 one said, where do they get their news? But the numbers from 2014 were that 49% got their news from social media. So there's a big jump there in just 3 years. Something that I do think is interesting, but probably doesn't surprise people, is that the impact of fake news varies by platform. Okay, so Facebook, 66% news from site. That's where people, 66% of these people said that's where they got their news from. 59% from Twitter, 70% from Reddit. I personally was a little surprised that Reddit bumped out Facebook. And then LinkedIn was 19%, YouTube 21%, and Instagram 23%. So if you do a little loose math with that, so don't quote me on this, but if you do a little loose math, if Facebook reaches 67% of U.S. adults, which is what people claim, and 2/3 of those people get their news from social media, that means that's 44% of the U.S. population. I find that a little troubling. So let's talk about how we can teach. What should we be talking to our students about, and what should we be teaching them? So, oh, I did not mean to do that for this slide. I'm so sorry. I hate it when people do this. And I don't remember how many bullets I had. So factcheck.org is one of the tools that Carol talked about. They actually have some really good information on there. And I think this is worth sending your students to or using as a basis for teaching. So consider your source. Carol talked about the abcnews.com.co. That's a pretty easy one to spot if people actually look. But also think about, there was a story that came out of WTOE 5 News. So that sounds very official. They actually admit, to their credit, I'm not sure, on their About page that it's a fantasy news website. I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's like fantasy baseball or what. And then the Boston Tribune that Carol mentioned, their contact us page lists a Gmail account, which is, but you know, it's funny how when I talk to students about this, they don't think about, like when you say it to them, they're like, oh, that's really obvious, but they don't think about it. So you can consider the source, read beyond the headline, right? There was some, I forget what the statistic was about what percentage of story, it's a huge, very high percentage of stories that are shared on Facebook where people don't even click on the story, they just read the headline and then share it. And that's how we got here today. You can also check the author, right? So can you find out more information about the author? They give an example on their website of a gentleman who is listed as the author of an article, and when they went to his author website, he claimed that he'd won, I don't know, like 8 Nobel Prizes and something, and no one by his name had ever won a Nobel Prize. So thinking about checking the author, who wrote it, what kind of sources do they cite, right? I mean, we're all familiar with that. Check the date. How current is it? Is it recycling an old story and trying to make it sound like it's current? Is it satire or a joke? I'm a big fan of Andy Borowitz, right? If y'all familiar with him, satire. I shared something on Facebook, and then I realized that like half the people reading it didn't recognize that it was satire, and I had to be like, sorry, satire, big flashing red letters. So you have to teach your students to pay attention to that. And check your biases. Carol talked about, does it make you really excited or really angry? Check your emotions. Does this play into what you think? And then consulting the experts, right? So there's some teachable tasks that we can get from this. And it's, oh good, it didn't do the slide-in thing. So when you design an assignment, some of the things that you could do. So one of the things that I've done is find a variety of stories that you're like, is it real? Is it fake? And you give the students the story, and you can give them a checkbox, you can give them a rubric, but you can have them work through some steps to try and determine whether or not it's fake or real. So upstream searching is one thing that you can do. Anybody who knows what upstream searching is? Show of hands. Okay, upstream searching is when you find the original story. So tracing back, where did it originally come from? Depending upon how many times it's been shared, that may be really hard to do. But that was actually one of the things that they tried to do in the research study that was published in Science, was trace back to the original source of the story. One way, so you can do that literally, you can try and trace it back through who shared it. Another way that you can sort of do that is reading laterally. So going out and seeing, is this the only source that is sharing the story? Do other people have stories on this? What are they saying about it? So upstream searching, you can have them do that. Syndication, right? Is this a AP story that's been shared? Who is creating the story? Where is it coming from? Same idea. Identity. Who is writing it? This is the whole author point. Is it a news source? Is it a company? Another kind of fake news are the native ads. Do you all know what native ads are? Yes, no? Okay. So native ads are promotional pieces that are designed to look like news stories. So they're created by companies or vendors, and they're not necessarily fake in the sense that all the information is bad, but they're not news in the sense that they're trying to sell you something, right? So some of these are pretty bad and they're pretty obvious. And like on the bottom of some news sites, you'll see the ads and they try to make them look like they're actual news stories, but they're really paid promotional items. And students need to understand the difference between that and real news. So that is actually a good exercise to pick out some native ad stories and give them to them and see who can recognize that it's not actual news. Read laterally, we talked about, because of what we do. In particular, I think that looking at the public authority of the website or who's saying it, is it a reliable source? One way of doing that, of course, is looking at the URL, but also just looking at the types of things that are on the website. So I forgot to add a screenshot of this. How many of you are familiar with the dihydrogen monoxide? Yeah. So I wish the guy would update it. So what this is, for those of you who don't know, is he's a professor. I actually think he's a professor of mathematics or something, but he was really disturbed by his students' inability to distinguish fact from fake. And so he created this website. And if you think about what dihydrogen, I'm the daughter of a chemist and a chemical engineer. So this is dihydrogen oxide, right? So he created this. It's pretty elaborate. It is outdated, so it doesn't work quite as well with students anymore because they think it's fake because it looks so outdated. But what's interesting about this example, if you Google it, there's actually a Wikipedia entry for it. There's a town in California that came this close to passing a municipal ordinance that nobody could sell anything that contained dihydrogen monoxide because it was so dangerous. And it's kind of fascinating. Even though that page is outdated, I recommend it's dhmo.org, I think. You can get some ideas for how to structure problems to have the students work through. And the reason that I brought that up is they have a little logo that sometimes students think means it's like environmental. Maybe it's the EPA. I think it's the EAP, and it has this. So anyway, I got a little off course there. For scholarly articles, I think talking to students about journal impact factor is important. My guess is that most of our students, in my experiences, don't know about journal impact factors. You can do this in a couple different ways. The easiest is probably Google Scholar. And you can literally go to Google Scholar, go into the metrics portion, and then you just type in the title of the journal, and it will give you an impact factor. They can exceed 30, but any impact factor over 1 is okay. Less than 1, run screaming. And then the tools. So tools like what Carol mentioned, teaching your students about the Wayback Machine, Internet Archive, Snopes, factcheck.org. Those are good things to show them. There are also international fact-checking sites that I won't go into now. But that is an idea of how you can take them through an assignment to have them figure out how to determine fake news. I do think it's important to talk to them. This is more of a conversation, I think, than the assignment, but talking to them about the filter bubble and the echo chamber and making sure that they understand that. And then I think that's it. So,
Chris, can you just go back to the last slide?
this one?
Yeah, so can you interpret that imagery for us, because I haven't seen this.
Sure. So it's really just a visualization of facts. So Google, Yahoo News, Netflix, Amazon, HuffPost, Washington Post, Flipboard. All of these things are using some kind of mechanism to try to show you things based on what you've searched for, what you've clicked on, those types of things. And so what happens is, right, it filters out the stuff that doesn't jive with what you've clicked on before, and it tends to suck everything in that agrees with you and leaves you inside that bubble. And actually, one thing that you can do if you want to talk to students about how to pop that, if you will, is talk to them about cookies, disabling cookies, erasing their search history, erasing their web history, using the highest privacy settings in Facebook. This one I thought was interesting. I hadn't thought about it, but not putting your birthday on things. So like in Facebook, you're asked to put in your birthday, or if you do put in the month and day, don't put in the year. So anything you can do to sort of not let them gather information on you is helpful, and that can be a helpful conversation to have with students. Yes, ma'am.
It may not be possible to not put your urine for some services
Yeah.
because they need that to prove they
Right.
medical. But
You can
don't
lie
about
though.
it if
That's-
you are
yeah.
and not be evaluating anything. Pretend you're much older than you are, or younger. if you
Yeah,
want to.
yeah.
So
Younger.
you don't pretend to be a minor. You're
Right, right.
But the other thing that I mentioned sometimes when I'm talking to people about this, and it's much less of a factor, but a lot of things are based on IP as well.
Yeah.
Because if you
Geography.
search for a word in one country, it might mean something different contextually than it does in another country. So encouraging people who really want to experiment with that to play around with the VPN and see if they get drastically different results.
Right.
Could be an interesting experiment
Right.
too.
Well, and I use DuckDuckGo. Do you guys know about DuckDuckGo? So you can use tools like that too to try. I don't delude myself that it's a silver bullet, but it's supposed to try and help block people from gathering that data on what kind of searching you're doing. Because, I mean, I'm sure that you all, like we get some strange questions in the library, and I'm doing searches that I'm not sure I want anybody to know that I've been doing, which does create interesting results sometimes, but there are tools that you can use to try and do that. So I just think talking to them about this is important. Other questions for Carol or myself? I surely do not want to keep us past 5:30. Yes.
Yeah, has anybody, going back to the definition of information literacy, has anybody considered the question of whether fake news is out there as entertainment as opposed to?
Well, to me, then that's satire, or it's something else. It has a purpose, but you have to be aware of what the purpose is. And I do think that the danger is that people don't recognize that something's a satire site, and then they take it as real, and that's when it becomes a problem.
Unfortunate.
But it is different. I mean, I get what you're saying. It's different than someone who's intentionally trying to deceive. Like the Onion is not making the claim that they're
Right.
not being, but
There are journalism articles that talk about the different categories because in addition to satire, you have hoaxes, pranks like the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot. You also shocker. There's and propaganda cherry-picked facts, and it's may not necessarily be untrue, but they slant it so strongly. So there are definitely studies to try to distinguish where those lines are. And I think that's why it's so difficult to have the conversation, because fake news can mean different things to different people.
But I actually think that's a distinction that you need to teach students, is the difference between satire and comedy, like you said, entertainment, and what's real. So I think it's a very good point. Anyone else?